Namaste and Namaskara. Welcome to another episode of India Unscripted. Today in this episode, we talk about our 6 segments. The information in these 6 segments, I think, are full of adventures and little known facts. So let's go right into them. In the first segment, Namma Bharat, we talk to you about our very dear Hanuman Chalisa. The historic facts around it, the controversies around it, and the bhakti around it. The soldiers of Akbar gone to Tulsidas ji's house and says, the emperor is calling you, please come. And Tulsidas ji actually refuses. And he got so angry that he ordered that Tulsidas ji be thrown in jail. So they actually dragged him. We then moved to Entrepreneur's Corner and talk to you about this very interesting company called Ugao. Now, Ugao came to my attention because often not when I'm on the stage giving keynote addresses, I'm often gifted a plant. And this plant is very well packaged in a box and it says Ugao. So I ended up reading about Siddhant and oh boy, is his story inspiring and interesting. So watch out for that. After that, we move into Women Matters. And this time we thought we should speak to you about Kangana Ranaut. Our very own Kangana, you can love her or hate her, but I don't think you can ignore her. Now her grandfather was Brahamchand Ranaut, an IAS officer. That kind of intrigued us, saying how does a granddaughter of an IAS officer kind of leave her family behind and just move to Mumbai and then come back to Parliament and win a Lok Sabha election. After Women Matters, we go to Kitabi Kida, and in Kitabi Kida, we talk about the Taj Mahal. Now, call it controversy or call it historic. I think it's for us to decide, but definitely a lot for us to think about. And the book is called Taj Mahal, The True Story by our very own P.N. Oak. We then go into the life of Madam C.J. Walker in the segment Real Talks. Now, you would have understood by now that I love Netflix and I love binge watching over the weekend. So we kind of took this story for a couple of reasons. One, it talks about the early stages of the African American racism and the struggles that she encountered. But more importantly, she kind of pioneered a new industry itself in the US. So her story, I think, has a lot for us to learn from, and also how she did not hold back, giving back to community when she became successful. And we end with What's the Scene, where we take you to Khajuraho. Yes, the famous Khajuraho, where we talk about the dance festival. So buckle up, fasten your seatbelt, let's go on another adventure for India Unscripted. Namma Bharat and Hanuman Chalisa. Today, we explore one of the most influential devotional works in Indian history, the Hanuman Chalisa and the legacy of Tulsidas. Originally written in Awadhi language, it's been adapted and translated in various Indian languages and continues to be translated in various Indian and foreign languages. Now, the origin of Hanuman is derived from 2 Sanskrit words, Hanu, that means jaw, and Man, that means prominent or disfigured, meaning one with a prominent jaw. Now, according to our scriptures, the young Hanuman, mistaking the sun for a ripe fruit, leaped to grab it. I think this is a story that we've all heard in our childhood. It prompted Indra, Lord Indra, to strike him with his thunderbolt. The blow hit his jaw, disfiguring it and giving him his name. His birth itself is layered. Born to Anjana, a celestial being cursed to live as a Vanara, and Kesari, his father, the Vanara chief, with the wing god Vayu playing a central role in his conception. Now, many traditions also consider him an incarnation of Shiva. This origin, marked by divine parentage and childhood adversity, shapes his identity as a powerful, devoted figure and highly revered in the Hindu tradition. He is also known by other names such as Anjaneya, Maruti, Bajrangbali, each reflecting a different aspect of his divine nature. Now, Hanuman Chalisa is a 40-verse Hindi hymn written by Tulsidas ji in the 16th century. It's regarded as one of the most powerful expressions of devotion in Hinduism, frequently connected to strength, protection, and inner resilience. Now, a little bit about Tulsidas ji. He lived in the 16th century. He was born around 1532 or 1543. He actually passed away in 1623 in Varanasi, our own Banaras or Kashi as we know it. Now, popular tradition claims Tulsidas was born to Atmaram Dubey and Hulsi in Soran, Kasganj district of Uttar Pradesh. Rambola Dubey, popularly known as Goswami Tulsidas, he was a Hindu saint, a devotee, a poet renowned for his devotion to Lord Rama. Now, he wrote several popular works in Sanskrit, Awadhi, and Braj Bhasha, but is best known as the author of Hanuman Chalisa and the epic Ramcharitmanas. Now, Tulsidas spent most of his life in the cities of Banaras, which I just shared with you is our modern Varanasi, and Ayodhya actually. The Tulsi Ghat on the Ganges, which is our Ganga Ma, the river, in Varanasi is named after him. He founded the Sankat Mochan Hanuman temple in Varanasi, and he is believed to have founded the temple at the same place where he had the vision of Lord Rama. Now, Tulsidas has also started the very famous Ram Leela plays. So, if you happen to be in the north of India and especially in Delhi, do not miss the Ram Leela. It's a fantastic folk theatre adaptation of the Ramayana. Now, he's been acclaimed as one of the greatest poets in Hindi and in Indian world of literature. The impact of Tulsidas and his works on art, culture and society in India, it's widespread and is seen today in the vernacular language and Ram Leela plays, even venturing into Hindustani classical music, popular music, bhajans, TV series. Now, Tulsidas himself has given very few facts and hints about events of his own life and various works. Bhaktamal, which is composed by Nabhadas, and that's anywhere between 1583 and 1639, and a commentary on Bhaktamal titled Bhakti Ras Bodhini, composed by Priyadas in 1712. Now, Nabhadas was a contemporary of Tulsidas and actually wrote a 6-line stanza on Tulsidas describing him as an incarnation of Valmiki himself. Priyadas's work was composed around 100 years after the death of Tulsidas ji and had 11 additional stanzas describing 7 miracles of spiritual experiences from the life of Tulsidas. Now, there are 2 instances that come to my mind that I thought I can share with you. The first is actually when he was praying to Lord Ram. He had a vision of Lord Ram, and his plea at that time, or his prayer that time, was that I need a vision of you. I want to see you and experience you with my own eyes. So one of these days, when he was deep in prayer and meditation, he actually heard a voice, and that voice said, Tulsidas, remember he was in Varanasi and there was Ram Katha that was happening very near to where he stayed. So this voice said, go and sit in that Ram Katha that is happening. And when you sit there, you will actually see a very old man sitting in the last row. Now that actually is Hanuman. It's so divine, right? So he did not waste any time. He ran to that place where the Ram Katha was happening. It was just beginning. So it used to happen on a daily basis, and he was noticing that there was this old man, and he was very sick, mind you, coughing, and his skin had all kinds of boils. So not a very captivating image. But he used to notice this old man coming. He would be the first to come and the last to leave, and he would very quietly sit in the last row of this Ram Katha. On one of these days, Tulsidas ji couldn't hold himself, and after the Katha was over, he ran and stopped this old man, and he said, "I know you're Hanuman, please show me your true form." And the old man kind of turned around and actually scolded him. He said, "You must have gone mad. I'm an old man. I'm in Varanasi. People come here in their last years of their life. Let me just be in peace and please go away." And at that time, Tulsidas ji turned around and said that, "I have Lord Ram himself telling me that you are Hanuman. So I can't wait anymore. Please show me your true form." And Hanuman did. And when Hanuman revealed himself, he actually also blessed Tulsidas with a vision of Ram in Chitrakoot. So next time you're in Varanasi, you never know, you may be walking around with the divine themselves. The second instance that I thought I should talk to you was the magic of Lord Ram's blessings. There is a ghat called the Manikarnika Ghat, where a lot of the bodies are lit. It is a pyre. It's a place which burns dead bodies and follows all the traditions of Hindus. So there was this procession carrying a dead body, and there was a woman along with this who was walking, alongside, and she happened to chance and see Tulsidas ji. And he was so respected and revered in Kashi that she immediately fell to his feet. And Tulsidas ji at that time is noted to have said Saubhagyavati Bhava in Sanskrit. Saubhagyavati Bhava, loose translation, is may you have a long married life. So when she got this blessing, she was very confused, and she turned around and said, "What kind of a saint are you? Don't you know that's my husband's dead body? I am taking your blessings because I am under a lot of grief, and you're blessing me as Saubhagyavati Bhava. I think you must have gone mad." So Tulsidas ji apparently turned around and said, "It's not my blessing. I've just uttered what Lord Ram has spoken through me." And he's supposed to have chanted Ram 3 times, and the procession continued. Now, after some time, the dead body woke up as if he had been in a slumber, in a deep sleep. And he looked around and he said, "Why have you brought me here?" The wife of the man immediately collapsed and cried and said, "That's the Mahima, or the magic of Lord Ram. And what I thought was impossible actually happened." And Tulsidas, mind you, was not a saint who boasted about his powers. He always maintained that he is simple man and a human being like you and I, and the magic is only because of Lord Ram. Now, why is this important, and why is it that I'm sharing with you? Because this incident reached the years of Akbar. Yes, the Mughal Emperor Akbar. It kind of gave birth to Hanuman Chalisa. Akbar now insisted that he meet Tulsidas, and he summoned him because he had heard about Tulsidas's miracles and wanted him to perform one for Akbar himself. The soldiers of Akbar are supposed to have gone to Tulsidas ji's house and says, "The emperor is calling you, please come." And Tulsidas ji actually refuses. He said, "Listen, I have nothing to do with Akbar. I have nothing to do with the kingdom. I'm very happy in my bhakti to Lord Ram, and please don't disturb me. And this surprised the soldiers, because who had the audacity to say no to the emperor of that time? So they actually dragged him, and then he was presented. Now, when he was presented to Akbar, Akbar said, "Perform a miracle for me." And Tulsidas ji is supposed to have said, "I don't perform miracles. I am a very simple man. Whatever miracles happens because of the blessings of Lord Ram. So I cannot perform a miracle for you." And Akbar got really angry. And he got so angry that he ordered that Tulsidas ji be thrown in jail. Yes, jail. And this was because Tulsidas ji refused the orders of Akbar. Now, when we talk about Akbar, we normally have this image, especially our generation, that Akbar was this handsome, tall man that actually looks like Hrithik Roshan. So I kind of dug up because I was visualizing the scene. In the historical records says Akbar was nothing like Hrithik Roshan. Actually, contemporary accounts describe him as a stocky, mid-height, bandy legs and a limp with a prominent wart on his face. Hardly the chiseled ideal that cinema represents him. His complexion was wheat colored. His eyes was intense, and he carried his head tilted to one side. Casting a tall, handsome actor erases this reality for us, replacing a distinctly Central Asian imperfect ruler with a domesticated Bollywood fantasy. The real Akbar was magnetic, of course. I mean, he was the emperor and he ruled all over India. The real Akbar had a presence. He was often known for running about informally in a lungi. Authority was actually rooted in rugged presence and not our classical good looks that we're used to. Now, cut to the court scene again. You have the emperor and then you have Tulsidas ji. The Akbar was very clear and simple. He said, "Please throw him in jail." And until and unless Tulsidas ji agrees to write verses in the praise of me, that is Akbar the Great, he is not going to get released. So naturally, orders was followed and Tulsidas ji was unfortunately thrown in prison. Now, the stories don't give us a detailed diary of his cell, but the general picture is one of harsh confinement. Accounts mention that he was tied with iron chains and held for a significant period of time. Some sources mention the period to be 40 days. Now, Tulsidas ji didn't break, turned his imprisonment into a spiritual practice. In his chains, he composed the now famous, revered Hanuman Chalisa, pouring his devotion into the 40 verses. Then came the big twist. Legend says that after reciting the Chalisa repeatedly, a troop of thousands of monkeys suddenly attacked Akbar's palace and city. Akbar, being the wise ruler, quickly connected the dots. He realized the miracle he had demanded was happening because of the imprisoned saint's devotion, not to him, but to Lord Ram. He immediately apologized to Tulsidas, ordered his release and sent him away with respect. What happened after that? That's the big question. Because remember, all of this happened in Fatehpur Sikri, the new capital of Akbar's empire. Now, there's often a question saying, did Akbar actually choose Fatehpur Sikri? Because if you look at records, and even today if you visit Fatehpur Sikri, they say that Akbar changed his capital. He went back from Fatehpur Sikri because there was no water. Now, why would an emperor actually choose to build a capital when they knew that there was a water problem? So I dug a little deeper and I understood there were two things. One was the lake that he had created for water, that dried up, and two, the monkeys who had attacked Fatehpur Sikri continued to attack on a daily basis. Akbar finally had to move away from his own capital, Fatehpur Sikri. Now, when we talk about the timelines of Tulsidas ji, another anchor in history is Surdas. Now, Tulsidas and Surdas, they are contemporaries in the 16th century itself of devotional poetry. While Tulsidas ji poured his heart into Rama, composing the epic Ramcharitmanas and the beloved Hanuman Chalisa, Surdas was completely consumed by Krishna, writing thousands of soulful verses in Braj about the flute playing God's childhood, antics, and Radha's longing. One worshipped the king of Ayodhya and the other the prince of Vrindavan. Both touched the soul of India with their words. We've spoken about the authorship of Hanuman Chalisa. Now let's talk a little bit about Hanumanji himself. Now, Hanuman is also known as Maruti, Bajrangbali, Anjaneya, many words, and is a very revered deity in Hinduism, celebrated as a divine Vanara and the devoted companion of Lord Rama. Central to the Ramayana, he is known for his unwavering devotion to Lord Ram and is considered a Chiranjeevi, meaning immortal being, and traditionally believed to be the spiritual offspring of the wind god Vayu. And don't miss the Anjaneya temple in Hampi, our very own Karnataka. It's believed to be Hanuman's very birthplace, perched on the Anjanadri hill with breathtaking ruins all around. Hanuman is also hailed as a master of grammar, even considered the ninth grammarian in the Hindu tradition, with his name itself demonstrating a Sanskrit grammatical rule. Now, speaking of Hampi, the Yantrodharaka Hanuman temple, the main idol is carved within a mystical six-cornered yantra on a granite boulder, making it a very unique pilgrimage spot. So, maybe in your next holiday, you should plan to go there. A Hanuman yantra is usually etched on copper or silver and is believed to channel Hanuman's energy for protection, strength, and courage, guarding you against evil and boosting confidence. Now, Hindus traditionally have always worshipped idols in temples, and it was because of Adi Shankaracharya responsible in a lot of ways bringing the yantra back into homes of all of us. In Hindu temples, the energy is always consecrated in the idols, and because of invasions, when the idols were destroyed, there was a lot of distraught sadness. And how do you actually protect these energies? And that is where Adi Shankaracharya actually brought back, not that it was not there earlier, but he actually brought back the yantras. And today, every home has a yantra. It really depends on the kind of energy that you want to channel in. For devotees, it's a spiritual tool, and the Hanuman yantra actually brings Bajrangbali's blessings right into your homes. Ramcharitmanas, Tulsidas ji is supposed to have spent much of his life composing on the banks of Ganga in Varanasi. So the next time you're in Kashi, visit the place where Ramcharitmanas was born. Coming to Hanuman Chalisa again, actually been sung by many popular bhajan, classical and folk singers. Rendition of Hanuman Chalisa by Hari Om Sharan was originally released in 1974 by the Gramophone Company of India and re-released in 1995 by the Super Cassettes industry. It remains to be one of the most popular bhajans and devotional music of our times. The original rendition is based on the traditional melodies in Mishra Khamaj, a raga belonging to the Khamaj Tat, with the bass note taken at the second black key or the Kali Do of the harmonium. I don't have a harmonium or an orchestra here, but I would have loved to chant Hanuman Chalisa in the traditional way. I think what I'll do now is to chant Hanuman Chalisa, and hopefully you will chant along with me. Shri Guru Charanasa Roj Raj निज मनु मुखर सुधारी, बरनऊ रघुबर बिमल जसु, जोदायक फलचारी। बुद्धिहीन तनु जानिके, सुमिरो पवन कुमार, बल बुद्धि विद्या देहु मोहि, हरहु कलेस बिकार। जय हनुमान ज्ञान गुण सागर, जय कपीस तिहु लोक उजागर। रामदूत अतुलित बल धामा, अंजनी पुत्र पवन सुत नामा। महावीर विक्रम बजरंगी, कुमति निवार सुमति के संगी। कंचन बरन बिराज सुभेसा, कानन कुंडल कुंचित केसा। हाथ ब्रज और ध्वजा बिराजे, कांधे मूज जनेऊ साजे। शंकर सुवन केसरी नंदन, तेज प्रताप महाजगवंदन। विद्यावान गुणी अति चातुर, राम काज करिबे को आतुर। प्रभु चरित्र सुनिबे को रसिया, राम लखन सीता मन बसिया। सूक्ष्म रूप धरि सियहि दिखावा, बिकट रूप धरि लंक जरावा। भीम रूप धरि असुर सहारे, रामचंद्र के काज सवारे। लाए संजीवन लखन जियाए, श्री रघुबीर हर्षि उर लाए। रघुपति कीन्ही बहुत बढ़ाई, तुम मम प्रिय भरत ही सम भाई। सहस बदन तुम्हरो जस गावे, असि कहि श्रीपति कंठ लगावे। सनकादिक ब्रह्मादि मुनीसा, नारद सारद सहित अहिसा। जम कुबेर दिगपाल जहाँते, कभी को विद कही सके कहाते। तुम उपकार सुग्रीव ही कीन्हा, राम मिलाए राजपद दीन्हा। तुम्हारे मंत्र विभीषण माना, लंकेश्वर भय सब जग जाना। जुग सहस्त्र जो जन पर भानु, लील्यो ताहि मधुर फल जानु। प्रभु मुद्रिका मेलि मुख माही, जलधि लाघि गए अजरज नाही। दुर्गम काज जगत के जेते, सुगम अनुग्रह तुमरे तेते। राम दुआरे तुम रखवारे, होत न आज्ञा बिनु पैसारे। सब सुख लही तुम्हारी सरना, तुम रक्षक काहू को डरना। आपन तेज सम्हारे आपे, तीनों लोक हाकते कापे। भूत पिशाच निकट नहीं आवे, महावीर जब नाम सुनावे। नासे रोग हरे सब पीरा, जपत निरंतर हनुमत बीरा। संकट ते हनुमान छुड़ावे, मन क्रम बचन ध्यान जो लावे। सब पर राम तपस्वी राजा, तिनके काज सकल तुम साजा। और मनोरथ जो कोई लावे, सोई अमित जीवन फल पावे। चारों जुग पर ताप तुम्हारा, है प्रसिद्ध जगत उजियारा। साधु संत के तुम रखवारे, असुर निकंदन राम दुलारे। अष्ट सिद्धि नौ निधि के दाता, असबर बीन जानकी माता। राम रसायन तुम्हारे पासा, सदा रहो रघुपति के दासा। तुम्हारे भजन राम को पावे, जन्म जन्म के दुख बिसरावे। अंतकाल रघुपरपुर जाई, जहाँ जन्म हरि भक्त कहाई। और देवता चित्त न धरई, हनुमत से ही सर्व सुख करई। संकट कटे मिटे सब पीरा, जो सुमिरे हनुमत बलबीरा। जय 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 हनुमान गोसाई, कृपा करहु गुरुदेव की नाई। जो सत बार पाठ कर कोई, छूटि ही बंदी महासुख होई। जो यह पढ़े हनुमान चालीसा, होय सिद्धि साखी गौरीसा। तुलसीदास सदा हरि चेरा, कीजे नाथ हृदय महडेरा। पवन तनय संकट हरण, मंगल मूर्ति रूप। राम लखन सीता सहित, हृदय बसुहु सुरभू. Now there's been a lot of commentary about the powers of Hanuman Chalisa. What comes to my mind is this line, भूत पिशाच निकट नहीं आवे, महावीर जब नाम सुनावे. We've seen it innumerable number of films, places, etc. Now, this is very important because for those seeking protection from ghosts, evil spirits, and bad omens, the Hanuman Chalisa offers a very powerful shield. It's the ultimate spiritual armor if you chant it with faith and where fear has no place. Another interesting did you know fact about Hanuman Chalisa is long before modern telescopes or NASA calculations, Tulsidas wrote a line describing Hanuman leaping towards the sun. Of course, the story is that he mistook it for a fruit, and that contains a shockingly accurate mathematical breakdown of the distance between earth and sun. In Hanuman Chalisa, it says, Yuga Sahastra yo Janapar Bhanu, Liyo Tahi Madhur Phal Janu. So, if you take the units of measurement used in ancient Indian Vedic periods and apply them to this line, the math almost perfectly aligns to modern science. Let's understand this. One yuga is actually about 12,000 years, and this is according to the Vedic cycle. So one sahasra means 1000. One yojana is equal to about 8 miles, which was a common ancient unit of distance at that time. So we'll now put it into the equation. 12,000 into 1000 into 8 is about 96 million miles. Now, NASA estimates today that the average distance from the Earth to the Sun is approximately 93 million miles. Now, coming to some commentary about our own saints. A name that comes to my mind is Swamiji Rambhadracharya. Now, he is blind, and a lot of us would have heard him on our YouTube channels. He has memorized the entire Chalisa, and his commentary about Hanuman Chalisa is something that I would recommend all of you to tune into. In one of them asks him saying, what is the right way or what is the ritual that we must adopt to pray and recite Hanuman Chalisa? And Rambhadracharya gives a very practical answer. He says you can pray and recite Hanuman Chalisa when you're walking, you're sitting, you're sleeping, you're reading. There's no ritual associated with it. All you need is a little bit of faith and belief, and miracles will happen. Now, the second person who comes to my mind when you talk about Hanuman Chalisa is Murari Bapu. Now, Murari Bapu needs no introduction, but for those who are new and have tuned in, he is a renowned spiritual leader, and he has been reciting the Ram Kathas for over 6 decades and speaks of Hanuman as the embodiment of 3 supreme elements: Ram Nam, the constant chanting of God's name; Ram Kam, executing the Lord's work; and Ram Dham, making one's heart the residence of Lord Ram. He explains that Hanuman is the perfect confluence of these 3, and obtaining Hanuman means obtaining Ram himself. Bapu also highlights that while Hanuman was tasked with rooting out demonism, he never sought to destroy the demons, only the negativity within. He describes Hanuman as a repository of immeasurable strength, possessing a body like a mountain of gold, and emphasizes that Hanuman Chalisa's 40 verses correspond to the 40 qualities of the inner self: mind, consciousness, intellect, ego, each with 10 attributes. Now, coming to pop culture, the reference that comes to my mind is that of Shekhar. In 2014, he dropped a soulful, chilled out rendition of the hymn as his 4th solo single. It was a heartfelt tribute to his late grandmother, for whom the Chalisa was her daily favorite. And unlike the usual high-speed recitations that we often hear today, Shekhar went for a soothing, lounge-like vibe. Now, this was launched by none other than Amitabh Bachchan himself. I can quote him. He says, "I want to empower people with the belief that your faith is larger than your fears." And he didn't top at the music. He even created a pocket book explaining Chalisa's meaning and a mobile app to keep the prayer just a tap away. If you think the influence of our beloved Hanumanji is just centered in India, you're wrong. He is globally respected. The name Barack Obama would be familiar to you. Yes, the 44th US president. He is a Hanuman fan too. In 2016, in an interview that now you can access on YouTube, Obama actually pulled out a tiny Hanuman statuette from his pocket. He revealed that a woman gave him the little Hanuman long ago as protection, and he carries these keepsakes to remind him of the people he's met along the way. When feeling tired or discouraged, he said he reaches into his pocket and thinks, yeah, that's something that I can overcome. Indians went wild over this. A Delhi temple actually gifted him a 2-foot gold-plated Hanuman idol for good luck in the elections. Not bad for what the Westerners call as a monkey god to be presented to the President of the United States, who isn't even a Hindu. Talk about inclusion. Let's talk about the sonic magic of Hanuman Chalisa. And a lot of research has been done about this as well. Now, the harmonium used, it acts like a noise cancelling buddy, masking chaos and helping your brain shift from the frazzled beta waves to calm focused alpha waves, perfect for studying. The tabla, which is the traditional percussion instrument that Indians use, or the dholak, it has this 8 rhythm beat. Now your brain actually starts vibing with it. That steady drumming can trigger what we call as theta waves, or the flow state zone, where deep meditation and memory recall kicks in like magic. And those manjira, or those cymbals that we use while singing bhajans, their high frequency sounds, which is typically above 8000 Hz, charge up your brain, zap the mental fog, and even induce gamma wave, which is the peak concentration mode for the next level of focus. And for students who've tuned in, you need to listen to the Hanuman Chalisa when you're studying for your exams. I'm sure it's going to do some magic. So basically, the Hanuman Chalisa isn't just prayer. Full-on brain boosting, wave shifting, focus, hacking, sonic experience. Students treat Hanuman Chalisa like a spiritual code, a code that boosts your confidence and memory during exams, hoping Bajrang Bali himself will help them jump over passing marks like he leaped across the ocean. The verse Bal Buddhi Vidya Deho Mohi is a direct plea for strength, intelligence and knowledge. While the verse Vidyavan Guni Ati Chatur describes Hanuman as highly educated, virtuous and sharp-witted, qualities students chant even today to invoke. The other verse, Sab Sukh Lahi Tumhari Sarna, Tum Rakshak Ka Huko Darna, reminds us that Hanuman as protector, when he is around, fear fades. Beyond the words, rhythmic chanting actually acts as a mantra meditation, and Hanuman's role as a remover of bad thoughts. So as we wrap up this segment, the question comes, what's the verdict on Hanuman or Hanuman Chalisa? He is just not a deity. He is an experience, an emotion, and so much more. English as a language, I think, fails to describe what we feel for Lord Hanuman. A Chiranjeevi who's been around times from the Rig Veda, but Rig Veda mentions him, so predating Rig Veda. A symbol of secure masculinity, a humble servant who bowed down to Sita, the ultimate student's best friend during exam season. Whenever you're chanting the Chalisa for focus, visiting His magnificent temples from Ayodhya to Hampi, or just drawing strength from his story, one thing is clear: Hanumanji is timeless, boundless, and absolutely unstoppable. He leaps across oceans, destroys negativity, and reminds us that true power lies not in flexing but in devotion, discipline, and humility. So, whether you're a devotee, a traveler, or just someone looking for a little extra strength or courage, Bajrang Bali's got your back. Jai Hanuman. Now we're in the segment Entrepreneur's Corner. Today we're stepping out of the boardroom and onto the balcony. Think about your morning commute. Honking cars, glass towers, concrete as far as the eye can see. That's urban life today. Fast, furious, and frankly a little grey. But what if I told you that right above our heads on terraces and balconies across India, a green revolution is quietly blooming? From high-tech hydroponics to dead space farming in luxury hotels, urban agriculture has evolved from a casual hobby into a $1 million tech-driven movement. We're talking urban farming, agri-tech, startups, and the entrepreneurs who are turning concrete jungles into edible landscapes. So grab your gardening gloves or just your headphones, and let's get unscripted. We start with a hard truth. Our cities are choking. Pollution, traffic, food that travels thousands of kilometers before it hits your plate. And who knows what's sprayed on it. We're eating chemicals, not vegetables. And we're losing connection to where our food actually comes from, isn't it? But here's where it gets interesting. A new breed of entrepreneurs are saying, enough. They're transforming actually empty corners, dead spaces, and forgotten balconies into thriving green ecosystems. Now let's bring this home. Bengaluru, India's Silicon Valley. We picture towering glass offices, late night boardrooms, and software engineers burning the midnight oil. But quietly, right above these corporate headquarters, something else is growing. Urban farming in India has exploded. One name stands head and shoulders above the rest, and that name is Ugao. But here's the thing, Ugao isn't just selling plants. They've cracked the code to building a profitable, asset-heavy green empire. And the story behind it is pure entrepreneurial gold. Founder Siddhant Bhalenge comes from a family legacy in agricultural seeds dating way back to 1885. Yes, 1885. That's over 130 years of farming DNA. But instead of sticking to traditional methods, Bhalenge studied landscape architecture abroad, came back to India, and saw something most people missed. India's urban gardening market was fragmented, chaotic, full of passion, but zero structure. That was a golden opportunity for him because he found the biggest consumer pain point, the guilt of killing a plant. And I think almost all of us have been guilty about it. How many of you have bought a beautiful plant, watched it wilt in a week, and never bought another one? Exactly. That's the retention killer. I mean, I remember that the first time I bought home a plant, it died because I took too much of a good care for it. I watered it and watered it and watered it every day, unfortunately, for it to die. But that guilt is something that all of us are familiar with. Now, first-time buyers stop purchasing if their plant dies within 7 days. This is researched. So Ugao didn't just sell plants, they have actually engineered survivability. So here's how they did it. First, they built massive automated polyhouse farms. He has about 25 acres near Pune and he scaled it to 100 acres, growing 500,000 plants every single month. Second, they treated soil like science. custom formulas engineered for specific indoor microclimates. No one size fits all, and he knows that the best. Third, and this is where it gets wild, they patented their own transit packaging. Shipping a live plant through India's chaotic e-commerce system is actually a logistical nightmare. But Ugao designed breathable, vertical locking boxes that can withstand over 5,000 kilograms of pressure. Think about it. Plant can now survive inside a dark delivery truck for up to 10 days and arrive perfectly alive at your doorstep. That is simply genius. Now let's talk about money, because this is unscripted and we don't shy away from numbers. Here's the reality. Selling plants is a high margin business. We're talking 70% to 80% margins at nursery level. But the catch, couriering a single plant in India can cost up to 100 rupees. Now that's nearly half the retail price, eaten up by only logistics. So how does Ugao stay profitable? They have adopted the omni-channel strategy. They process over 1 million orders annually across their own website, Amazon and quick commerce platforms. They are pivoting aggressively to offline retail as well. And they've set up, I think, about a lot of stores in 10 major Indian metros. Now, these are physical stores because regional fulfillment hubs reduce delivery costs and increase customer trust. And people like you and me, consumers and the market actually notice this. Ugao has now secured a massive 47 crore rupees Series A funding round led by V3 Ventures alongside DSG Consumer Partners and RPG Ventures. And they're just not burning cash now, which is common in startups, especially if you are familiar with the hockey stick model. So here in Ugao, they're not burning cash, they're actually profitable. Now that's rare in the startup world. The lesson here for us, severe constraints breed incredible innovation. No land, build vertical farms. High delivery costs, engineer better packaging. Fragmented market, integrate backward and control the entire supply chain. It's not just about selling plants. It's about rethinking how cities can now feed themselves. But alongside this, there is a new movement growing. Entrepreneurs are proving that you don't need acres of farmland to grow food. You just need a balcony, a vision, and a willingness to challenge the status quo. The message is clear. Agriculture and technology are reshaping urban life. So the next time you look at your own balcony or that empty corner in your living room, ask yourself, could this be a farm? Because the future of food isn't just in the fields, it's right above our heads sometimes. And that's how entrepreneurs are rethinking how cities feed themselves. Now, speaking of rethinking, our next story is about a woman who rethought everything from success, fame, and power. Our upcoming segment, Women Matters. Women Matters. In this segment, we're talking about a woman who doesn't just break the box, she sets it on fire. Kangana Amardeep Ranawat. 4 national awards, Padma Shri, a member of parliament, actress, director, producer, and one of the most fearless voices in India today. Let's talk about her a little bit, because Kangana's story isn't a fairy tale, it's a war cry. Born in a small town in Himachal Pradesh, Mandi district, into a Rajput family, Kangana was never the girl who followed rules. One of the stories goes like when her father gifted her brother a plastic gun and gave her a doll, she refused to accept it. She questioned discrimination from day one. Known to be stubborn, rebellious, and unapologetically herself. Now, mind you, her grandfather, Brahamchand Ranawat, was actually an IAS officer. And if you look at the history of our family, there have been politicians, bureaucrats, and a whole lot of service to the nation. So, when you come typically from that kind of a background, which believes in education, a lot of dignity, her story really stands out because at 16, she left home for Delhi. Her father obviously didn't approve of it. He actually refused to sponsor a pursuit he considered aimless. He couldn't figure her out. She was alone, surviving on bread and pickle, training under the theatre director Arvind Gaur at the Asmita Theatre Group. The industry treated her like an outsider. No connections, obviously. No godfather. No safety net. In 2006, she debuted with the movie Gangster, and she was just 17 years old. The role, an alcoholic woman caught in a love triangle, raw, intense, unpolished. The critics were bowled over because this girl was real. She actually went on to win the Filmfare Award for the Best Female Debut. Then came Tanu Weds Manu in 2011, a game changer. She played Tanu, a foul-mouthed and free-spirited girl, and people actually finally saw her range in acting. But the real explosion came in 2013 with the movie Queen. Now the director was Vikas Bal, and this is a story where a girl is abandoned by her fiancé but chooses to still go on her pre-booked honeymoon alone. And this covers very picturesque spots of Paris and Amsterdam. And the story is so beautifully woven in that you in fact start resonating with her as one of your own family members. Now in this movie, Kangana didn't just act, she became Rani. And in this movie, she also co-wrote the dialogues. She poured her own struggles into the character. What followed was the National Award and a cult following. Now, after Tanu Weds Manu's success, Tanu Weds Manu Returns also followed, and this time with a double role, Tanu and Datto, two completely different women, same actress, same film. She won her second consecutive National Award for the Best Actress. Not bad, isn't it, for an outsider who couldn't speak English? But Kangana refused to be just an actress. She became a voice. In fact, in 2017, she appeared on Karan Johar's famous couch, Coffee with Karan, and called out nepotism. The industry was furious. The media had a field day. She, being her, she didn't flinch. She spoke her truth and she wasn't taking it back. Since then, she's been publicly unapologetic, calling out the Bollywood mafia, speaking against gender bias, supporting farmers, taking on the establishment. In 2020, she received the Padma Shri, launched Manikarnika Films, and directed the famous movie Manikarnika, the Queen of Jhansi. And with that, she won her fourth national award. Now, success always looks glamorous, but let's now go a little bit behind the glamour, behind the success, behind the beautiful photo ops that actresses are known for. For Panga, for example, one of the movies that she featured in, she trained like a professional kabaddi player for 5 months. Squats, lunges, attack strategies, footwork. Her coach actually said she picked up dodging techniques just by observing, something that takes young players today 6 months to learn. She gained weight for her post-pregnancy scenes, lost it, gained muscle, and became indistinguishable from professionals on set. Then came Talaivi. And for that movie, she gained 20 kilograms to play Jayalalitha. 20. And then she lost it all. That's not acting, that's commitment and that's sacrifice. In 2024, she won the Mandi Lok Sabha seat as the BJP candidate. Now, from Mandi to Parliament, from a girl mocked for her English to a woman who speaks on behalf of millions. And she's still the same Kangana. Bold, unfiltered, controversial. Banned on Twitter, mind you. Slapped at an airport, controversy. Receiving death threats. Her Mumbai home was actually partially demolished by the BMC. The Bombay High Court later called it malicious and ordered compensation. She called India's 1947 independence bheek or charity and said real freedom came in 2014. She has been reprimanded by her own party, mind you. But she doesn't apologize. She stands by her beliefs, even when it costs her. And yet, behind all that fire, she's still that daughter who celebrates Father's Day with throwback photos, proud of her roots, visiting Bambla every year. She's fiercely protective of her sister Rangoli. Now, Rangoli is an acid attack survivor. She has spoken openly about how her sister's strength has inspired her. She's expressed her desire to remain unmarried. Now let's see where they take that. Never say never. She follows Swami Vivekananda, practices vegetarianism, studies Kathak, and has even enrolled in a screenplay writing course at the New York Film Academy. When asked about Ranveer Singh being targeted for his Dawn 3 exit, remember, post-success of Dhurandhar, that famous press conference which has now gone viral, she actually pointed out to what she calls the industry's Pakistan prem, saying most films teach us to admire Pakistan, and when a film shows Pakistan's real face, people get uncomfortable. And on women in society's backward mentality, she's been clear. She does not tolerate disrespect towards women. She fights for women's narratives. She speaks against double standards. She says loudly, proudly, that success isn't something you get by sleeping your way up. It's earned, fought for, bled for. So what is Kangana Ranaut's legacy? She walked into Bollywood with no godfather, no connections, and today has walked out with 4 national awards. The outsider who became the insider. The rebel who became the ruler. The girl who was told she couldn't but proved that she could, and at the highest levels proved everybody wrong. She's been called difficult, a diva, even a loose cannon, and many other names. But you know what? She's never been called a pushover. From emotionally intense characters to a warrior queen, from a kabaddi player to playing Indira Gandhi, our former Prime Minister, from struggling actress to a member of parliament, Kangana has done it all on her own terms. Because that's what Women Matters is about. Women who refuse to be silenced. Women who speak their truth, even when it's unpopular. Women who take the hits and keep standing. Women like Kangana Ranaut. Now that's your dose of Women Matters for today. Kangana Ranaut, flawed, fierce, and absolutely unforgettable. And now it's time for Kitabi Kira, where we crack open the books, challenge narratives, and dive into stories that make you go, wait, what? Today we're talking about a book that claims one of the most famous monuments in the world, one of the 7 wonders, the Taj Mahal, is not what you think it is. The book is called Taj Mahal, The True Story by Purushottam Nagesh Oak. And let me tell you, this is not your average history book. Now, on Taj Mahal, there is also a movie that got recently launched. Now, I think it streams on Amazon Prime and Apple TV. Now, this movie features Paresh Rawal in the lead as a tourist guide, and he works for the ASI. It's actually directed by Tushar Amrish Goel. Now, coming back to the book, this is 336 pages of pure adventure, controversy, first published in 1968 as the Taj Mahal is a Hindu palace, then expanded in 1989 to its current form. This book is essentially a 30-chapter manifesto arguing that Taj Mahal was originally an ancient Hindu temple palace called the Tejo Mahalaya, or Lord Shiva's palace, built centuries before Shah Jahan came along, mind you. Oak doesn't just question history, he takes it, flips it upside down, and shakes it until all the coins fall out. Now, let's get into the juicy chapters. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the 30 chapters, but I've taken out some snippets which will help you understand the book a little better. These are the ones that will make you raise an eyebrow so high that it might get stuck. Now, in chapter 2, Admission in Shah Jahan's own Badshah-Nama, this is where Oak drops his first bombshell. He points to Shah Jahan's own court chronicle, which states that the emperor acquired a manzil, a kind of a palace from Maharaja Jai Singh. Not vacant land, mind you, a palace. Oak's argument: if Shah Jahan acquired an existing building, then the Taj Mahal wasn't built from the scratch, it was repurposed, and that changes everything. Now let's jump to chapter 4, Aurangzeb's letter and recent excavation. Oak pulls out a 1652 letter from Aurangzeb complaining that the Taj Mahal was leaking. His logic: a newly built structure shouldn't be leaking within 20 years. Unless, of course, it wasn't new at all. Pretty clever, right? Chapter 5, Peter Mundy's Evidence. An English visitor to Agra within, I think, a year of Mumtaz's death described the Taj as a noteworthy building. Now, Oak's question is that if Shah Jahan had just started building, why was it already impressive? He also cites that another traveller, Johann Mandelslo, who visited in 1638, just 7 years after Mumtaz's death, he actually made no reference to the Taj being under construction. Suspicious? Oak thinks so. Now, chapter 16 is Babur lived in Taj Mahal, and this one's wild. Oak claims Babur, who is Shah Jahan's great-grandfather, mind you, had already admired the Taj's beauty a century earlier. Now, if true, that completely destroys the built by Shah Jahan narrative. Oak says Babur's memoirs mention the Taj as a beautiful palace, proving it existed long before the Mughal emperor was even born. Now, chapter 22 talks about carbon dating of the Taj Mahal. Oak claims that carbon dating of a riverside door showed it was 300 years older than Shah Jahan. Critics have slammed this methodology, but it's undeniably a great headline. Imagine if scientific evidence actually proved that the Taj existed before even the Mughals. Now that would rewrite history books completely. Now, chapter 24, the Taj Mahal originated as a temple. This is a big one. Oak lays out his Hindu architectural evidence in this. Lotus motifs, trishuls, Kalash designs, and even the octagonal shape of the building, all pointing to a Shiva temple. He argues that the central dome, the chhatris, and the internal chambers follow ancient Hindu temple architecture, not Islamic design. Walking through the Taj, he says you're actually walking through a temple dedicated to Lord Shiva. Now, moving to chapter 26, and this talks about the inconsistencies in the legend. Oak actually attacks the love story itself. He points out that Mumtaz's name was never Mumtaz Mahal, but Mumtaz ul Zamani, he argues you can't just drop three letters and call it a building. The word Mahal has never been used for a building in any Muslim country, from Afghanistan to Algeria. He calls the entire romance actually a fairy tale created by court sycophants. I don't know how you're going to digest this. Now, chapter 28 talks about the methodology that actually led to the discovery. Oak actually defends his controversial approach in this chapter. He argues that negative evidence and historical revisionism, as he calls it, have actually buried the truth. He claims mainstream historians have deliberately ignored evidence because it didn't fit their colonial narrative. Now let's move to chapter 30, the last chapter of the book. And in this, he speaks about a pictorial analysis. The book includes visual comparisons of a Hindu temple architecture versus the Islamic mausoleum design. Oak doesn't just tells you, he actually shows you in the book. Now, you may ask, who is this man behind this 336-page roller coaster? Now, P.N. Oak is not just another person who came up with a theory. We'll understand his life a little better. He was actually a freedom fighter who risked his life for India. In 1941, he joined the British Army and was posted to Singapore. When Singapore, and if you remember history, Singapore fell to the Japanese, he became a prisoner of war or a POW. But instead of accepting his fate, he joined the Indian National Army. And that was led, if you remember, by our very own Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose. He fought alongside the Japanese against the British to liberate India. Now, when a war ended and the INA collapsed, unfortunately, Oak escaped on foot from Singapore to Assam, a grueling journey that took nearly 2 months. Now, 2 months, imagine this, of jungle, danger and survival. After independence, he worked as a Class 1 gazetted officer in the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting and wrote for publications in those times, for publications such as the Hindustan Times and the Statesman. In 1960s, he pivoted to his life's mission, rewriting Indian history. He founded the Institute for Rewriting Indian History and published a quarterly. It was called the Itihas Patrika. Now, this wasn't a casual hobbyist, as many claim. This was a man who had fought for his country and was convinced its story had been stolen, and the white man was to blame for it. The book's co-claim, the word Taj Mahal is actually a corruption of the word Tejo Mahalaya, which is Lord Shiva's palace. Shah Jahan took over an existing Hindu structure, rebranded it, and the love story, well, if you want to listen to Oak, he calls it a fairy tale created by court sycophants. He also claimed that the sealed rooms in the Taj still contain a headless statue of Shiva and other Hindu worship objects even today. Fearing political backlash, Indira Gandhi's government reportedly tried to have Oak's book withdrawn from the bookstores and even threatened the publisher. But here's the question we should ask. Did historians actually buy it? Well, the verdict is not a clear one. Not exactly, I would say. The academic world has called it pseudo-scholarship. Agree or disagree? Historian Giles Tillotson pointed out that the technical know-how to create a building with the structural form of Taj simply did not exist in the pre-Mughal era. Now, a story will always have two sides to it, right? Critics also say Oak misunderstood the Persian source, the Manzil he cited was built by Jaisingh's ancestor Raja Man Singh, a 16th century Rajput king, not some ancient structure. The Archaeological Survey of India has also submitted its report, I think in 2017. But I think that report calls the Taj still a tomb. In 2000, the Supreme Court of India dismissed his petition, famously saying that he had a bee in his bonnet above the monument. So, whether your team Tejo or team Taj, I mean, like I said, the verdict is still out there. One thing certain, this book is an absolute page turner. 336 pages, 30 chapters, zero consensus, and a whole lot of wait, what? It's not history, it's a historical thriller with footnotes. That's your dose of Kitabi Kida for this episode of India's Unscripted. It's time for Real Talks, where we bring you stories that deserve the spotlight, the screen, and sometimes their very own Netflix series. We're talking about a woman who didn't just break the glass ceiling, she smashed it with a hair pomade in one hand and $1 million empire in the other. Madam C.J. Walker, the first female self-made millionaire in the United States of America. The OG boss lady, the woman who turned a $1.0 product into a fortune. And if you haven't watched Self-Made on Netflix, starring the incredible Octavia Spencer, stop everything and add it to your list. But here's the thing. Madam C.J. Walker's real story is even more jaw-dropping than the series. For this, we have to rewind to 1867 in the state of Louisiana, a cotton plantation. A baby girl is born to parents just freed from slavery. They name her Sarah Breedlove. She's the first in her family to be born free. But freedom didn't mean things were easy. By 7, she was an orphan. By 14, she married just to escape an abusive brother-in-law. By 20, she was a widow with a 2-year-old daughter. She moved to St. Louis, worked as a laundress, scrubbing clothes in boiling water for only $1.50 a day. Some days, she nearly made enough to feed her own daughter. Sarah started losing hair due to a scalp condition and of course poor diet and malnutrition. She looked around. There was no products for black women's hair. None. White entrepreneurs ignored the market. Black women were using harsh soaps that made things worse. So Sarah did what entrepreneurs do. She solved her own problem. She experimented. She mixed petroleum jelly with sulfur, a combination around for a century, but never marketed properly. She created Madam Walker's wonderful hair grower. Then she did something genius. She became her own walking advertisement. Her hair grew back. Other women noticed. They wanted it too. But she wasn't selling a product at that time, mind you. She was actually building her own army. In 1905, she moved to Denver with her savings. She married Charles Joseph Walker and renamed herself. It's at that time that she became C.J. Walker and she added the name to Madam. Now the Madam was a nod to French beauty, sophistication and class. She went door to door demonstrating products on herself, selling directly to black women in their homes, churches and community meetings. Then came the master stroke. She created a network, the magic of network. She trained thousands of women as beauty culturalists. So culture and beauty kind of went hand in hand. By 1917, she had trained over 20,000 women. Now, these weren't just employees, they were entrepreneurs themselves. They earned commissions, they built their own businesses. She moved her headquarters to Indianapolis, built a factory, a salon, a beauty school, a lab, all run predominantly by women. She even stipulated in her own company's charter that only a woman can serve as a president. By the time of her death, which was in 1919, Madam Walker was worth over 1 million, equivalent of millions of dollars in today's currency. She had employed 40,000 people across US, Central America, and the Caribbean. But here's what makes her legendary. She didn't hoard her wealth, she gave it all away. Thousands to the anti-lynching fund, scholarships for 6 women at the Tuskegee University, donations to black YMCAs, schools, orphanages, and churches. She built a villa in New York designed by a black architect, not just to live in luxury, but to host leaders like Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and many others. A space where black excellence could be celebrated and strategized. Let's talk about how this incredible story made it to the screen actually. The series is based on a book, On Her Own Ground, by A. Leela Bundles, Walker's own great-great-granddaughter. That's the secret to its authenticity. It was shaped by the woman's own family. The production itself was a labor of love. Kasi Lemons, who directed the acclaimed Harriet Tubman biopic Harriet, helmed the first 2 episodes. Demaine Davis directed the final 2. Now, both brought the perspective of being black and female to the storytelling. And that's where the magic happened. Cinematographer Kira Kelly lensed all 4 episodes. Mind you, a black female DP, and there aren't those many today. The showrunners wanted color, jewel tones, emeralds, sapphires, vibrant patterns, and Kelly delivered. On the production design side, production designer Britt Doughty had just 3 months to build an entire universe across Ontario in Canada. From cotton fields to city streets to the villa, all brought to life with painstaking detail. Costume designer Karen Wagner used costumes to tell Walker's journey. Early days are reflected in plain cotton. Rising success, bright silks and wool. The Mughal era, hand-embroidered vests and two-toned shoes, a flex because poor people wore all black shoes those days. Hair director Ethelene Joseph brought in a team of 24 stylists, 24 of them, and they used 250 wigs. Now, Octavia Spencer alone wears 14 different wigs in the first episode. The production insisted everyone on set had natural hair. No chemical straightening, no weaves. One hair director even convinced a background actor to remove her wig, saying Madam C.J. Walker worked hard so that we didn't have to glue on somebody else's hair on our heads. Now, Octavia Spencer leads the cast and also served as the executive producer. Tiffany Haddish plays her daughter, Leela. Blair Underwood plays C.J. Walker. Cameron Ejogo plays Addie Munro, her mentor turned rival. Spencer's performance earned her a Primetime Emmy nomination. The series was produced by Spring Hill Entertainment, co-founded by LeBron James alongside Warner Bros. Television. Everything that's successful is not without its own controversy. And here comes the complicated part. The show introduced colorism as a subplot, and that wasn't really a part of the real history. Walker's real life rival, Annie Malone, was actually a dark-skinned black woman just like Walker. But the series has actually cast a light-skinned actress to play the villain, making it look like Walker was motivated by insecurity about her own skin color. Even Walker's own great-great-granddaughter called it out, saying the show defaulted to drama instead of celebrating their real legacies. The real Walker, she was proud to be a black woman. She featured herself and other brown-skinned women in her ads. And when most hair care ads used white or nearly white models, she chose to be herself. The show makes for great TV, but it's not exactly history. It's entertaining, but I felt somewhere it reduces Walker's complex legacy to petty rivalries rather than celebrating her as a philanthropist, activist, and a pioneer who lifted thousands of black women. So, what's the verdict? The numbers don't lie. In 2024 alone, the series pulled in a whopping 5.5 million views globally. In 2025, it was still clocking over 2 million views. That's staying power for a limited series on Netflix about a woman history almost forgot. And here's what stays with me about her story. And I'm going to quote her. She says, "I'm not ashamed of my past. I'm not ashamed of my humble beginning." Don't think that because you have to go down in the washtub that you are any less a lady. She is also known to have once said, "There is no royal flower strewn path to success. And if there is, I have not found it. For what success I have obtained is the result of many sleepless nights and real hard work." That's real, that's raw, that's the kind of hustle we celebrate on Real Talks. What's the scene? The last segment of our episode, India Unscripted. Here we talk about the Khajuraho Dance Festival. Now, it is one of India's most prestigious celebrations of classical dance, held annually against the backdrop of UNESCO-listed Khajuraho Group of Monuments in the state of Madhya Pradesh. It's often described as the place where India's ancient temple heritage and living performing arts meet. The festival began in 1975 actually and has been held annually ever since. Now, created by the government of Madhya Pradesh to preserve and promote India's classical dance heritage, it draws attention to the artistic significance of Khajuraho's temples. So, why was it started? Now, the first was to preserve classical dance traditions. India's classical dance forms have ancient roots, and many of you already know it. And many of them are actually closely linked to the temple culture. The festival provides a national platform for these traditions to be performed and appreciated, ensuring that they continue to thrive in the modern era. Second reason is to celebrate the connection between temple art and dance. Now, the sculptures of Khajuraho depict musicians, dancers, gods, celestial beings, and scenes of everyday life. The festival symbolically brings those stone dancers back to life through live performance, creating a powerful bridge between the past and the present and leaving hope for the future. The third is to promote cultural tourism. The festival attracts artists, scholars, photographers, tourists, and culture enthusiasts from India and abroad, helping preserve and showcase India's heritage while also boosting the local economy and the global cultural awareness. Now, let's talk about the historical and the architectural significance of Khajuraho. Khajuraho, for those who don't know, was the capital of the powerful Chandela dynasty, which built around 85 temples between the 10th and the 12th centuries. Today, about 20 of these temples survive and are recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. These temples are renowned for their intricate carvings and exquisite architectural detail. While many visitors know Khajuraho only for its erotic sculptures, it's important to note that those represent only a small portion, maybe about 10% of the total artwork. The temples also depict a rich variety of themes, including dance, music, warfare, spiritual life, daily life, mythology, and nature. The sculptures today serve as a visual encyclopedia of life in medieval India, capturing both the sacred and the secular. Now, where does this venue and this dance performance actually happen? Most performances take place in an open air setting, so visualize that, near the Chitragupta temple and the Vishwanatha temple within the western group of temples. The illuminated temple architecture creates, I think, one of the most dramatic performance venues in the world. The ancient stone structures serving as a breathtaking backdrop to the living art of dance. Now, the combination of light, sound, and the heritage makes for an unforgettable cultural experience. I know you're now getting restless, so we're now going to come to when it's held so that you can book your tickets. Traditionally, the festival takes place every year from the 20th February to the 26th February, lasting 7 full days. The timing coincides with the transition from winter to spring and India's broader cultural festival season, making it an ideal time for visitors to experience the region's beauty and cultural vibrancy. Now, who's behind this breathtaking festival? Who are the organizers? The festival is organized by the government of Madhya Pradesh through cultural bodies such as the Ustad Alauddin Khan Sangeet Evam Kala Academy, with support from the state's culture department and the tourism department. Their collective efforts ensure that the festival maintains its high standards and continues to grow in stature every year. Now, the Khajuraho Dance Festival stands as a testament to India's enduring cultural legacy, and that's why we chose to speak about it in today's episode. By bringing together classical dance traditions and ancient temple art, it offers a unique experience that educates, entertains, and inspires. As it continues to draw audiences from across the globe, the festival not only preserves India's heritage but also ensures that its artistic traditions remain vibrant and relevant for generations to come. So I hope you enjoy the Khajuraho Dance Festival this year. I was really excited to bring to you 6 very unique stories in today's episode of India Unscripted. I hope you have enjoyed listening to them as much as I have enjoyed presenting them. Behind every episode is a very hard-working team of research, of scholars, of enthusiasts of culture of India, and a technical team that produces episodes every week. So I really hope you take the time to share with your friends and to like and comment on this episode. This is India Unscripted, and like we always say, stay strong, stay curious, stay unscripted. I'm Yashaswini Ramaswamy, signing off from Culture Calls.